Everyone in the ballroom froze for a second when the sound of porcelain shattering echoed through the marble-floored gallery. A tray of coffee had slipped from a trembling hand and splashed across the legs of a wealthy investor's wife. All eyes turned, not with sympathy, but with anticipation, because Damien Cross, the fearsome billionaire, was about to speak. Dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed cut from the night itself, Damien stepped forward with a smirk carved in stone. "If this is what passes for professionalism," he said, loud enough for every camera and every socialite to hear, "perhaps she should try carrying water in the fields instead." The laughter was instant, cruel, and contagious. Lily stood frozen, her white work shirt soaked with coffee, hands trembling, lips unable to form an apology. But what broke her wasn't the insult, it was the way no one defended her. She wasn't a person in that room. She was a target, disposable, forgettable. Damien turned without another glance, confident he'd be celebrated for his wit by morning headlines. He didn't know her name, he didn't care. But Lily would remember this night for the rest of her life. That night, Lily walked home in silence, drenched not only in coffee but in humiliation. Her sneakers scraped the pavement with tired defiance, and the streetlights cast her shadow long and ghostly behind her. The city didn't pause for her heartbreak. It never did. But in the solitude of her cramped apartment, something ancient stirred. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't hurt, but because she was done being small. Damien Cross had mocked her publicly, but he'd ignited something he couldn't control. In her bookshelf, dusty under layers of bills and old resumes, she pulled out a box, her mother's wedding dress, simple, ivory, untouched. "One day you'll wear it when someone truly sees you," her mother once said. Lily stared at it now, fingers tracing the fabric as if touching courage itself. That dress had waited in silence, just like her. But not much longer. She'd been invisible her whole life, but humiliation had a strange power. It burns away hesitation. She wasn't sure how yet or when, but one day she would walk into Damien's world not as a servant, but as a storm. Meanwhile, Damien Cross continued building empires from glass towers and cold negotiations. The incident at the gala, forgotten by morning. His publicist had even posted a meme of his coffee field remark, turning his cruelty into trending sarcasm. To Damien, the world was a machine, and he was the only hand that knew how to operate it. But what he didn't know was that something was shifting beneath the surface of his perfectly controlled reality. While he made power plays in boardrooms and helicopter pads, Lily began rebuilding herself piece by piece. She enrolled in evening classes, started working with a discreet startup in the fashion industry, volunteered backstage at charity auctions. People began to see her, not the intern, but the woman behind the eyes. Her voice grew stronger, her spine straighter. All the while she kept the dress, not as a dream but as a promise. Every morning she looked in the mirror and whispered, "One day you'll walk into his world, and he won't laugh." Damien, surrounded by luxury and silence, didn't realize that someone he once humiliated was no longer standing in the shadows, but rising toward the light. Months passed, and Lily's world transformed quietly but powerfully. By day she still worked, still served, still listened. But by night, she designed. Sketches filled her walls, dresses, silhouettes, bold ideas stitched with fire and dignity. Her hands, once used to carry trays, now created. The startup noticed. One evening, the founder handed her a sealed envelope, an invitation to the annual Legacy Hearts Gala, an elite fashion event hosted by the Cross Foundation. Damien's name was at the top of the guest list. Her breath caught. The same event where careers were born or destroyed. She sat with the envelope for hours. That name, that room, that memory. Could she really return? Could she face him? Not as the girl he mocked, but as a woman who had become everything he said she wasn't. She opened her closet. The wedding dress waited, untouched, not for a groom, not for romance, but for war. The night of the gala arrived. The venue sparkled with chandeliers and polished egos. Photographers swarmed the red carpet as cars pulled up in waves. Damien Cross stepped out of his custom Rolls-Royce, flanked by a model whose name he couldn't remember. His presence turned heads, cameras flashed. Inside, champagne flowed and conversations hummed like a beehive of vanity. Then the room shifted. The music didn't stop, but silence rippled in its place. A figure stood at the entrance. Not a model, not a celebrity, but every eye locked on her. Lily. She wore the wedding dress like it was woven from vengeance and grace. The same girl he humiliated, but not the same woman. Her back was straight, her gaze steady. The dress was no longer her mother's. It was armor. Damien turned slowly, not recognizing her at first, but when he did, the glass in his hand trembled. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, Damien Cross, the man whose words built empires and shattered reputations, was speechless. Lily walked past him without a flinch. She wasn't there for his validation. She was one of the featured designers, and her line was set to close the evening. The dress she wore wasn't just symbolic. It was part of her collection, scars and silk. Backstage, murmurs buzzed among executives, whispers about her past, her rise, and the fact that the fearsome billionaire looked rattled. As her models took the runway in pieces inspired by resilience and rebirth, Lily stood with the mic at the finale. She looked directly at Damien. "Some people use power to break others. I prefer to sow strength into silence." The crowd erupted. Damien didn't clap. He stood frozen. Because in that moment he understood. She hadn't come back for revenge. She came to remind him of what real power looked like. Walking away. The event ended in a whirlwind of applause, interviews, and admiration. But none of it felt real to Damien. For the first time, he wasn't the center, he wasn't the storm. He was the silence after it. As guests filtered out, Lily avoided him completely. That bothered him more than the headlines that would follow. That night, Damien poured himself a drink in the silence of his penthouse, but it didn't taste like victory. He replayed her words, her walk, her poise. He searched online and found clips from the gala, her mic drop, the standing ovation, the whisper from an anchor. "That's the girl he humiliated, isn't it?" The fearsome billionaire wasn't feared in that moment. He was forgotten. And it stung more than anything. In a world that moved for his approval, she had moved through it without even glancing back. Lily, however, didn't retreat into the shadows. The next day, social media exploded with images of her in the dress. "The intern who silenced a billionaire," one headline read. Her designs sold out overnight. Her brand was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. People wanted to know more, not just about her clothes, but about her story. And when they learned what Damien had done to her months before, the public's loyalty shifted. For the first time in his life, Damien's name wasn't synonymous with prestige, but with arrogance. Sponsors pulled out of deals. Influencers mocked him in viral trends. The fashion world, once his playground, now watched him with judgmental eyes. Meanwhile, Lily signed deals, gave interviews, and smiled, not because she was vindictive, but because she had built something no one could take from her. Especially not him. One afternoon, a bouquet arrived at Lily's studio, white orchids, a note tucked between the stems. "I didn't see you before, but I see you now. D." She read it once, twice, then dropped it into the trash. Flowers didn't erase humiliation. A spotlight didn't rewrite history. She hadn't risen to get his attention, she'd risen to prove to herself that she could. The team around her, once skeptical interns and cautious assistants, now treated her with reverence. She wasn't just the girl who wore the dress, she was the woman who redefined what it meant to stand tall. And as she zipped up another gown, preparing for a new runway, she smiled. Not at Damien, but at her reflection. The same woman he once mocked had become untouchable, not because of fame, but because she no longer needed to be seen. Damien's world didn't fall apart overnight, but it cracked in places that once felt indestructible. Invitations stopped arriving. Partnerships were postponed. His social capital, once as solid as steel, corroded in silence. And worst of all, he began to feel what he'd spent his life avoiding: reflection. In quiet moments, he remembered not just Lily's glare, but the way she walked into that gala with the poise of someone who no longer carried his shame. He found himself watching interviews of her late at night, rewinding the way she spoke about dignity, resilience, and silence as strength. It wasn't bitterness that gnawed at him, it was realization. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes he poured over her, and in doing so, she became what he had always feared, unforgettable. Weeks later, a prestigious university invited Lily to speak at a commencement ceremony. She hesitated at first, until she saw who was listed among the honorary guests: Damien Cross. The irony was sharp. She didn't decline. She stood on that stage before hundreds of graduates, wearing a tailored white pantsuit of her own design. Her speech wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity, and how the hardest thing in life wasn't failure. It was being dismissed before you've even started. In the audience, Damien sat in the third row, alone. He didn't clap at the jokes. He didn't fidget. He just watched. And for the first time, he didn't look like a man surveying a business opportunity. He looked like someone finally understanding the cost of being feared. After the ceremony, Damien approached her. No cameras, no entourage. Just a man whose empire had taught him nothing about grace, until he saw it in her. "You didn't just change the room," he said quietly. "You changed the way I look at it." Lily looked at him, not with anger, but with distance. "That's the difference between you and me," she replied. "You needed to lose power to find perspective. I had to lose dignity to build it." He nodded slowly. There was nothing else to say. She turned away, not in hate, but because there was nothing left to reclaim. Her silence was no longer submission. It was closure. In the months that followed, Lily's life blossomed beyond even her boldest sketches. Her designs were featured in global fashion weeks. She launched a foundation for young women in creative fields who lacked access, support, or belief. Every success was a quiet rebellion against the world that once ignored her. And yet, she remained grounded. She refused luxury for luxury's sake. Her studio remained small, her team loyal. She designed not for red carpets, but for the kind of woman who had once cried in silence, unsure of her worth. The wedding dress she once wore, it was no longer hidden in her closet. It was on display in her studio, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that never needed to shout. As for Damien, he disappeared from the spotlight. No more interviews, no more speeches. His name still echoed in financial circles, but with a different tone, muted, cautious, human. Some said he moved to a quiet town abroad. Others claimed he began funding rehabilitation programs anonymously. No one knew for sure. But one thing was certain: the fearsome billionaire had changed. And while the world might forget why, Damien never would. In every quiet moment, in every echo of applause that wasn't for him, he remembered the woman in the white dress, and how she never looked back. One evening, Lily was invited to a private dinner hosted by one of the world's most influential philanthropists. The event was filled with visionaries, leaders, and cultural icons. At her table sat women who had built schools, written revolutions, survived the unspeakable. She felt honored but also humbled. As dessert was served, one of the women leaned in and said, "You don't know me, but when I saw you walk in wearing that dress, I decided not to quit." Lily felt her throat tighten. The dress, the moment, the pain, it had become something greater. It wasn't about Damien anymore. It was about every woman who'd ever been told to be small. And it was working. Later that night, walking home through the city lights, Lily paused outside a tailor shop that had gone out of business years ago. It was the first place that let her practice on scrap fabric. Through the dusty window, she saw her reflection, layered against memories of her younger self. She thought of how far she'd come. Not in fame or wealth, but in peace. Her past didn't haunt her anymore. It empowered her. She didn't want to erase what had happened with Damien. She wanted others to see that even the deepest wounds could be sewn into something enduring. The dress was no longer just hers. It belonged to anyone who had ever been dismissed and decided to stand anyway. Months passed, and she began writing a memoir, not about fashion, but about silence, and what it means to reclaim it. Publishers fought for it before she finished the first draft. In the opening chapter, she wrote, "This isn't a story about a billionaire who changed. It's about a woman who didn't need to." The line went viral before the book even launched. It was quoted in protests, stitched into clothes, posted across campuses. Lily had become more than a name. She had become a language for quiet power. And that language echoed louder than any insult Damien had ever spoken. Meanwhile, one of Damien's old business partners reached out. He wanted to feature Lily in a documentary about leadership and the cost of influence. She declined the first offer, then the second. But when they sent her a draft of the script, one that included testimony from women who had been silenced and dismissed just like her, she agreed, not to tell her story again, but to show that she was never alone in it. The documentary launched on a global platform. It wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever felt invisible and chose to speak with action instead of anger. 1 year later, she walked into a bookstore for a quiet signing event. It was raining, and few people were expected. But the line wrapped around the block. A teenage girl stepped up with trembling hands, holding a worn sketchpad and a borrowed copy of Lily's book. "You taught me that silence doesn't mean weakness," she whispered. Lily signed the page, smiled softly, and hugged her. That night, as the store emptied, Lily stood at the window watching reflections ripple on wet glass. She had once been a ghost in someone else's story. Now, she was the light that helped others write their own.